The judge's gavel fell, and I watched my husband check his phone. That was the detail that would stay with me. Not the judge's monotone recitation of legal dissolution. Not the finality of hearing, the marriage between the parties is hereby terminated. Not even the hollow sensation of watching 9 years of my life get reduced to a court stamp and a file number. James was looking at his phone. He'd been doing it for months, really. The device had become an extension of his hand, a barrier between us that I'd stopped trying to breach. I remembered the first time I noticed it, maybe 2 years into our marriage, at a dinner I'd spent 3 hours preparing. He'd scrolled through emails while I talked about my day, nodding absently, and I'd told myself he was just busy. We were both busy. That was what marriage was, wasn't it? Two people building something together, even if sometimes one of them was building and the other was just there. But in that moment, in the sterile fluorescent light of the family cord, I saw his shoulders drop, just slightly, almost imperceptibly. The kind of release that comes when something heavy finally lifts. I knew that release. I'd felt it myself, months ago, when I'd finally stopped hoping he would come back to me. When I'd accepted that the alpha I'd married, the one who'd spun me around in a parking lot and called me his CFO, was gone. I watched his thumb hover over the screen. His wedding ring was gone. He'd taken it off 3 months ago, slipped it into his pocket one morning, and never put it back on. I'd noticed. I always noticed. That was the problem. I noticed everything, and he noticed nothing. Then his screen lit up again. I was seated close enough to read the message before he tilted the display away from me. Mom, Marcus loves the penthouse. The realtor is holding it until 3. I felt something twist in my chest. Not jealousy. I had stopped being jealous somewhere around the time I realized James was scenting someone else and didn't even bother to hide it well. It was something else. Something rawer. The knowledge that while I was sitting here, watching my marriage officially end, he was already planning a future with someone else. Someone younger. Someone who hadn't spent 9 years slowly disappearing into the background of James's life. 3 hours after our divorce became final, James planned to tour a $2.1 million penthouse with the alpha he'd been scenting for barely 4 months. For months. I'd given him 9 years, and he'd replaced me in 4 months. I remembered our first date. He'd taken me to a restaurant on the waterfront, the kind of place I couldn't afford on my own. He'd ordered for me. I thought it was charming then. He'd asked about my job, my family, my dreams. He'd listened. Really listened. Or so I thought. I wasn't surprised. Surprise required hope, and I'd exhausted that particular resource somewhere between the 8th and 9th year of a marriage that had slowly, methodically suffocated me. James stood, gathering the court papers into his leather portfolio. He adjusted his cufflinks, silver, monogrammed, a gift from his mother on our 5th anniversary. I watched his hands, the way they moved with practiced efficiency. I'd watched those hands for 9 years. I knew the way they curved around a coffee mug in the morning, the way they gestured when he was excited about a deal, the way they'd once reached for me in the dark. When he passed my chair, he paused. The oceanside condo is ready. I looked up. What condo? The old 2-bedroom. The one we used to rent to grad students. Of course. I knew exactly which one he meant. The building was nearly 50 years old. The underground parking flooded every time Seattle got heavy rain. The kitchen counters were cracked in 3 places, and the heating system had failed twice the previous winter. I remembered standing in that condo 3 years ago, looking at the water stains on the ceiling, and James saying, "We should just get rid of this place. It's not worth the headache." James himself had called it a liability, and talked about selling it for the land value alone. Now it was my fresh start. I had my assistant drop off the keys, he continued. Most of the furniture is still there, so you can move in immediately. I didn't respond. I just looked at him. 9 years. 9 years I'd given him. 9 years of building his business, managing his household, caring for his mother, holding everything together while he flew around the country making deals. 9 years, and he was giving me a condemned condo. He seemed to interpret my silence as hurt. There's no mortgage on it, he added. It's worth about $400,000. For one Omega, it's more than enough. More than enough. James had always loved that phrase. For suits were enough. My scent suppressants were fine as they were. The household budget was enough. After I left my career, I didn't need my own income because James made enough for both of us. Now he'd decided what was enough for me after divorce too. A worn-out condo he no longer wanted, while he prepared to spend over $2 million on his new life with his new alpha. I remembered the first time he'd said that phrase to me. We were engaged, looking at apartments. I'd wanted the one with the bigger kitchen, the one where I could actually cook without bumping into cabinets. He'd said, "This one is more than enough. We don't need all that space." I'd agreed. I'd always agreed. I picked up my bag. Got it. He hesitated. I could see him waiting for something. Tears, perhaps, or anger, or one final plea. I knew what he expected. He expected me to fight, to cry, to beg him to reconsider. That was what Omegas did, wasn't it? That was what he'd always believed. That when push came to shove, I'd fold. Instead, I stood. "Ethan." I stopped. "I really don't want this to turn ugly." There was something almost sincere in his face. Almost. "Our marriage is over. I think we should both move on." I looked at him for a long moment. 9 years. 9 years of my life. And this was what he had to say. Not "I'm sorry." Not "thank you for everything." Not even a genuine goodbye. Just a warning not to make things difficult. I agree. He gave me a small nod. Good. Then he left. The door clicked shut behind him. I stood there for a moment, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade down the hallway. I thought about following him. I thought about screaming. I thought about all the things I'd never said, all the times I'd swallowed my hurt because I didn't want to make waves. Then I sat back down. My attorney, Victoria Chun, waited a few seconds before speaking. He still has no idea. No. The temporary financial order should be entered this afternoon. What time? Hard to say. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. I glanced at the clock. 11:09 a.m. Then I thought about the message on James's phone. I hope it happens before 3. Victoria frowned. What happens before 3? He's buying a new place this afternoon. How much? 2.1 million. Victoria slowly removed her glasses. Today? Today? For the boyfriend. Technically, he's buying it as his new home. I paused. But Marcus is already choosing rooms and furniture. Victoria stared at me. Then she put her glasses back on. Well, that could get awkward. I laughed for the first time that morning. I hadn't planned it. It came out sounding hollow, almost brittle. I know, but the timing is impressive. At 2:47 that afternoon, I was sitting in my best friend's apartment when she sent me a photo. I'd gone to Jenny's place after court because I couldn't face my own apartment. The one I'd shared with James for 6 years. The one with his scent still lingering in the bedroom, in the bathroom, in the kitchen where we'd cooked together in the early years. The one I was going to have to pack up and leave. Jenny had opened the door, taken one look at my face, and pulled me inside. She'd poured me a glass of wine. It was barely noon, but she didn't care, and sat me down on her couch. "How bad?" she'd asked. "He's taking his new alpha house hunting this afternoon." Jesus Christ. 3 hours after our divorce. Jesus fucking Christ. That was why I loved Jenny. She never tried to make me feel better. She never said things like "it's for the best" or "you'll find someone else." She just got angry on my behalf. She always had. Margaret, read the caption. My former mother-in-law stood in front of a wall of windows overlooking Puget Sound. I recognized Margaret's posture, the way she held herself, the way she tilted her head just slightly to the right. I'd seen that posture for 9 years. I'd sat across from her at Thanksgiving dinners, at Christmas gatherings, at birthday parties. I tried so hard to make her like me. Beside her stood Marcus Chun, 31, an architect, broad-shouldered and sleek-haired, younger than he'd appeared in the few social media photos I'd seen. He was handsome. I couldn't deny that. He had that clean, polished look that James had always been drawn to. Behind them, the late afternoon sun glittered across the water. The penthouse had 4 bedrooms, a private elevator, floor-to-ceiling windows, and a view that stretched across the bay. Asking price, $2.1 million. James planned to buy it as his post-divorce home. Margaret had apparently already decided Marcus would move in eventually. Your ex-mother-in-law just told Marcus to pick what he likes, Jenny texted. James wants this to feel like your home too. I stared at the photo. 9 years earlier, Margaret had taken me house hunting. She'd held my arm exactly like that. She'd smiled at the realtor and said Ethan is family now. What belongs to James belongs to him too. I was 23. I was young and naive and so desperately wanted to be accepted. I believed her. I remembered that day so clearly. The way Margaret had steered me towards certain houses, away from others. The way she'd smiled at me and said, James needs someone who will support him, Ethan. Someone who understands that his career comes first. I'd nodded. I'd understood. I thought that was just how things worked. That was what alphas needed. That was what omegas did. My phone buzzed again. Victoria. Order entered. The judge's temporary financial restrictions were officially in place. They didn't freeze every dollar James owned. They didn't shut down his company. They covered a group of disputed investment accounts, interests in several LLCs, and large transfers connected to properties that still had to be sorted out in the divorce. James could still run his business. He could pay employees. He could cover normal expenses. What he could not do was move large amounts of disputed money into new investments, transfer it to someone else, or pull cash out of properties while we were still figuring out who legally owned what. I checked the time. 2:52 p.m. I thought about James at the sales gallery. I thought about him pulling out his phone to authorize the deposit. I thought about the look on his face when it didn't go through. 7 minutes later, Jenny video called me. She was hiding near the back of the sales gallery. I could see the edge of a potted plant in the frame, the glossy leaves partially obscuring her face. Ethan, what happened? They can't send the deposit. I sat up straighter. What? She turned the camera. James was standing beside a table covered in purchase paperwork. A transaction coordinator was speaking to him in a low voice. This wasn't a situation where someone swiped a credit card and got declined. James had planned to wire a $300,000 earnest money deposit into escrow. The transfer couldn't be completed. The funds are coming from an account listed under a new court restriction, the coordinator explained. Her voice was professional, calm, the kind of voice that had probably delivered bad news 100 times before. James's face hardened. This is a normal real estate purchase. I understand, Mr. Reed. But the funds are restricted pending clarification from your attorney. Margaret finally realized something serious had happened. I watched her face shift from confusion to concern to something that looked almost like fear. What court restriction? James turned slightly. Mom, give me a minute. What do you mean, give you a minute? You said the divorce was over. Marcus looked up. What do you mean the divorce was over? Everything went quiet. I could see Marcus's expression through Jenny's phone. The slow dawning of realization. The way his jaw tightened. The way his posture shifted from relaxed to defensive. He stared straight at James. You told me you'd been divorced for 6 months. James's jaw tightened. Marcus, let's talk outside. Did you get divorced this morning? We've been separated for a long time. That isn't what I asked. Marcus's voice was flat. Flat in a way that made me recognize something in him. He was an Omega too. I knew that flat voice. It was the voice you used when you were trying not to fall apart. Did your divorce become final this morning? James said nothing. His silence answered for him. Marcus slowly put the floor plan back on the table. You lied to me. It's not that simple. Then start with the simple part. He picked up his bag. When did you get divorced? Margaret stepped in. Marcus, does the exact date really matter right now? Marcus turned to her. It matters to me. Then he looked back at James. I'm leaving. I'll drive you. No. He stopped near the door. Figure out what's going on with your divorce and your money first. Then he added, quietly but clearly, when you understand your own life, maybe then you can talk to someone else about a future. He walked out. Jenny pulled the camera back toward herself. I finally understand the phrase public disaster. I didn't answer, because the failed deposit was the smallest part of James's problem. The real question was why the court had decided that money he kept calling his was still disputed at all. My phone rang less than 10 minutes later. James. I answered. What did you do? No hello. No Ethan. Just that. Good afternoon to you too. Why is my investment account restricted? You should call your attorney, James. His voice dropped. This came from you. Victoria requested it after the forensic accountant found a risk that disputed assets were being moved. Those are business assets. Then prove that. Reed Property Holdings is my company. No one said you didn't start it. Then why are you touching my company? There it was. My company. I leaned back in Jenny's sofa, feeling the leather cool against my neck. 9 years. 9 years of working alongside him. And it was still my company. Why did your financial disclosure list only 4 jointly owned investment properties? Because the others aren't marital assets. What about the other 16? They're held by separate companies. Were those companies funded with money earned during our marriage? The business structure is more complicated than you understand. Then let the accountants sort it out. He exhaled sharply. I could hear the frustration in his breath, the same frustration he'd always turned on me when I asked too many questions. I didn't hide anything. I separated business assets from personal assets. That sentence told me almost everything. James didn't even think of what he'd done as hiding. In his mind, he built the company. He negotiated the purchases. He dealt with lenders. Therefore, the properties belonged to him. What I'd done along the way barely counted. Good, I said. If everything is as clear as you say, this should be easy to prove. He went quiet. I could hear him breathing on the other end of the line. I remembered that sound. I remembered lying next to him in the dark, listening to him breathe, thinking that this was the sound of home. Then, how much do you want? I don't know. What does that mean? It means I don't know the full value of what we own yet. You listed 4 properties. 2 years ago, I saw 17 on the internal asset report. I paused. You bought 3 more after that. I'd like to know where those assets went. Some are company-owned. Fine. Some were mine before we got married. Then there will be purchase records. Some belong to my mother. Then she'll have proof she funded them. He was silent again. Do we really have to do this? Yes. This time I answered immediately. I need to know what's real. I hung up. Only then did I notice my hand shaking. Jenny saw it too. She didn't tell me to calm down. She just poured me a glass of water and set it in front of me. I drank half of it. A few minutes later, the shaking stopped. Are you okay? Jenny asked. I don't know. Did you mean what you said? About needing to know what's real? I looked at her. I meant every word. 6 months earlier, James had asked for a divorce. He did it over dinner. He'd even opened a bottle of red wine first. The good stuff. The 2016 Cabernet we'd been saving for a special occasion. I remembered thinking, at the time, that it was strange he was opening it. It was a Tuesday. There was nothing special about the day. I think we should end this. I looked at him. I'd just taken a bite of the salmon I'd spent an hour preparing. I chewed and swallowed before I spoke. You've already decided. I've been thinking about it for a long time. Have you? Ethan. How long, James? He didn't answer. I later learned he'd already met Marcus by then. But Marcus wasn't the thing that finally broke something inside me. James's attitude did. I asked him what happened with the property. We'll be fair. He said it easily. I'm not going to leave you with nothing. At the time, that sentence actually made me feel better. That was how far I'd drifted. I thought being promised something was proof of fairness. I told Victoria, if he's reasonable, I don't want to fight over every little thing. Then James's first financial disclosure arrived. For jointly owned investment properties, I read the addresses twice. Where are the others? Victoria looked up. There are more. At least a dozen more. You're sure? Yes. I was sure because I prepared the original loan paperwork for several of them myself. I remembered that time so clearly. It was the second year of our marriage. James wanted to buy a 4-unit rental building in the University District. It was his first serious attempt to grow beyond a few small properties. He'd been so excited about it, pacing the apartment and talking numbers at me while I tried to follow along. The bank rejected his loan application. That night, he dropped the rejection letter on the kitchen counter. They don't understand the deal. I picked it up. Your cash flow model is wrong. He frowned. No, it isn't. You calculated all 4 units as rented 12 months a year. They're almost always full. Banks don't underwrite almost. I opened my laptop. You also didn't reserve enough for repairs, and your net operating income is off. He stared at me. You got all that from one page? I'm a CPA, James. That night, I worked until after 2 a.m. I remember the way the blue light of my laptop screen reflected off his sleeping face. I remember thinking that this was what marriage meant. This was what it meant to support someone. By breakfast, I'd rebuilt the model. We spent 3 days fixing the application, vacancy rate, maintenance reserves, operating expenses, debt coverage. The second time we went to the bank, I went with him. The loan was approved. When we walked into the parking lot, James grabbed me around the waist and spun me once. I didn't marry a CPA, he laughed. I married my CFO. I remember the way he looked at me that day, the way his eyes lit up, the way he held me close. I thought we were partners. I thought we were building something together. Years later, that building was worth almost 3 times what we paid for it. It also helped James qualify for the next property and the next. Back then, my financial skills were part of our success. By the end of our marriage, the story had changed. I was simply an Omega who hadn't had a real job in years. The change happened slowly. So slowly I didn't even notice it at first. At first, James asked me about everything. What do you think of this deal? Does this financing look bad? Can we carry this mortgage if the units sit empty for 2 months? I had a company email. I helped with budgets. I reviewed loan documents. I organized financial reports. Then Margaret had hip surgery. At almost the same time, James's company began expanding. He traveled constantly. I remember the night he came home from a week in Chicago. He looked exhausted. He sat down at the kitchen table and said, I can't keep doing this. Keep doing what? Everything. The travel. The business. The house. Mom's recovery. He rubbed his temples. Maybe you should leave your job for a while. I'd just moved into a more senior role at my accounting firm. I'd been so proud of that promotion. I'd worked so hard for it. Leave now. We don't need your salary anymore. What happens later? If you want to go back, you go back. He took my hand. We're a family. We don't have to calculate every contribution. I looked at his face. I saw how tired he was. I saw how much he needed me. I thought about all the nights he'd come home late, all the dinners I'd eaten alone, all the times I'd told myself it would get better once the business was stable. I resigned the next week. For the first 2 years, I still helped with the business. I just didn't have a title anymore, or a paycheck. I was still doing the same work, but somehow it didn't count anymore. It was just something I did, like cooking dinner or doing laundry. Eventually, James hired a full-time finance director. I remember meeting him, a sharp beta named Robert, fresh out of a master's program. I'd trained him on the systems I'd built. I'd shown him how I tracked everything. I asked James once, "Do you think I should go back to work?" He shrugged. "Things are good the way they are." A year later, at a company event, I stood beside him while he introduced Robert to a group of investors. "Finally," James joked, "I have a professional handling the numbers." I held a glass of champagne. He didn't even notice what he'd said. Later, I asked him about an investment I didn't recognize. He barely looked up from his phone. "The structure's complicated now." "What does that mean?" "You haven't been involved in years. It's hard to explain. At the beginning, you're my CFO. Later, you don't need to work, I'll take care of us. Then, you don't really understand the business anymore. And finally, during divorce, you haven't had income in years." 2 weeks into the financial review, the forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed beta named Derek Park, spread a chart across the conference table. "I found the properties you remembered. 16 properties missing from James's original list, held through 4 different LLCs. I looked at the chart. It was beautiful in its clarity. Properties at the bottom, companies in the middle, people who controlled those companies at the top. 2 LLCs changed ownership 2 years ago. A familiar name was added. Margaret Reed, James's mother. Did she actually put money in? On paper, yes. Derek slid over a bank statement. One of James's companies transferred $180,000 into Margaret's account. 5 days later, the same amount came back. Only the label had changed. Margaret Reed Capital Contribution. Can we say he transferred ownership to her? Not yet. Derek tapped the page. But we can say the source of the money deserves a closer look. I stared at the numbers. The money left one pocket, passed through Margaret, then came back wearing a different name. That discovery was also why Margaret showed up at Jenny's apartment the next day. James's attorney had apparently explained that because Margaret's name appeared in 2 disputed LLCs, Derek would request records showing where her investment money had come from. Suddenly, this wasn't just her son's divorce. Her own accounts were part of the paper trail. Jenny opened the door. Margaret walked in without sitting down. She looked older than I remembered. Or maybe I just hadn't realized how much she'd aged. "Withdraw the restrictions." "I can't." "You requested them. They're court orders now." She placed her handbag on the table. "The Oceanside condo goes to you. Plus $250,000. I waited. I remembered the first time I'd met Margaret. I'd been so nervous. I'd spend hours picking out the perfect outfit, the perfect gift, the perfect thing to say. She'd smiled at me and said, "You're so sweet, Ethan. I can see why James likes you." That was the first time I'd felt like I wasn't enough. Like I had to earn my place. "That's fair," she said. "Why?" She frowned. "Why what? Why is that fair? You're one person. How much money do you need?" I almost laughed. "James is buying a $2.1 million home. Does he need that much?" Her face changed. "That's his money." Finally, there it was. Not enough. Not fair. Not practical. His money. "Margaret, after your surgery, who drove you to physical therapy?" She didn't answer. "When your husband died, who organized the insurance paperwork, the property records, and the estate files?" "That's what family does." "Exactly." I nodded. "I thought so too. I never sent you an invoice for my time. But now you're telling me that because I didn't receive a salary during those years, I made no financial contribution to the life James and I built." She tightened her mouth. "Taking care of family doesn't make you the owner of a real estate company." I never said it did. I stood. "That's why lawyers and accountants are going through the records. If something belongs to James, I won't take it. If something belongs to me, I'm not giving it up because you think I've already been given enough." Margaret picked up her purse. You're going to destroy his company. No. I opened the door for her. If the records are clean, the company will survive just fine. And if they aren't, I didn't create the problem. She left without another word. I closed the door and leaned against it. My hands were shaking again. Jenny came over and put her arms around me. You did good, she said. I feel like I just fought a war. Because you did. The second major discovery didn't look like a victory at first. A month later, James's attorney produced 3 family loan agreements. The explanation was simple. Several properties had been purchased with money Margaret had personally loaned James. If that was true, some of those assets could be treated differently in the divorce. The agreements totaled more than $600,000. They had dates, signatures, interest terms. They looked legitimate. I read all 3. Then I looked at Victoria. What if they're real? Then we treat them as real. So some of those properties may have less community interest than we thought. Correct. For the first time since the investigation began, I felt truly uncertain. I'd spent months searching for assets James hadn't fully disclosed. But that didn't mean everything I remembered automatically belonged to both of us. Some properties really had been purchased before our marriage. Some money might genuinely belong to Margaret. I spent that night lying awake in my rental apartment, the one I'd moved into after James asked for the divorce, the one with the thin walls and the neighbor who played music too loud. I stared at the ceiling and wondered if I'd been wrong about everything. If James was right. If I really was just an omega who hadn't worked in years, trying to take something that wasn't mine. The next morning I told Victoria, if they can prove something is James's separate property, don't fight over it. She watched me. You're sure? Yes. I met her eyes. I want what belongs to me. 3 days later, Derek called. You should come in. He placed one of the loan agreements in front of me. $400,000. Loan date is May 14th, he said. I nodded. Margaret's bank balance on May 13th was $68,000. I looked up. So where did the $400,000 come from? Derek turned the page. On the morning of May 13th, $400,000 left an investment account jointly owned by you and James. That same day, it entered Margaret's account. The next day, Margaret loaned exactly $400,000 to James's company. Same amount. Less than 24 hours apart. I stared at the statements. The day before, I'd honestly considered the possibility that the money was hers. It wasn't. At least not originally. Derek closed the file. When you put transactions in chronological order, complicated things get simple very quickly. He was right. The money left our account on Monday, passed through Margaret, came back on Tuesday, then a document called it a family loan. That was the entire trick. The third discovery changed the case. Derek called me one afternoon. We found a refinance application for one of the rentals. Current value is around $950,000. James had applied for a cash-out refinance. If it closed, he could pull almost $400,000 in cash out of the property. The refinance itself wasn't the biggest issue. The timing was. The application had been submitted after our divorce case was already underway. Worse, James had signed a statement saying the property was solely held through his investment company and had no undisclosed marital ownership dispute. But when the property was purchased 7 years earlier, the down payment came from a joint account. My financial information had even been included in the original financing file. I looked at James's signature. I'd seen that signature 1,000 times. On birthday cards. On loan documents. On the marriage certificate we'd signed 9 years ago. He signed this after we filed for divorce. Yes. And after both sides were told not to move major assets. Yes. If the refinance had closed, he would have taken almost $400,000 in cash. Yes. There was no complicated business explanation for that. He knew we were dividing property. He knew the asset was disputed. and he was still trying to pull money out of it. 3 days later, Victoria asked the court for targeted financial restrictions. That was the order that happened to take effect the afternoon James tried to fund the penthouse escrow. There was no dramatic secret freeze. No trick. The court simply said, until the property dispute is resolved, you cannot move large amounts of money out of accounts and assets that are still being divided. James's new home happened to run directly into that restriction. Marcus emailed me during the 3rd week. I was surprised to see his name in my inbox. I almost deleted it, but something made me open it. His message was short. He apologized first for the penthouse incident, for the awkwardness, for the way he'd found out. Then he asked one question. Could I have been unknowingly pulled into your property dispute? That was why he contacted me. After the penthouse disaster, James kept telling him the same story. I couldn't accept the divorce. I was using my accounting background to make ordinary business structures look suspicious. Marcus had started wondering whether he'd somehow been involved in a transaction he didn't understand. We met at a coffee shop near the waterfront. I got there early. I wanted to see him before he saw me. I watched him walk in, tall, broad-shouldered, that same clean-cut look I'd seen in the photos. He looked nervous. His hands were shoved in his pockets. The first thing he asked was, "Do I need a lawyer?" "I don't know." He looked alarmed. "But I haven't seen anything suggesting you were involved in his business or asset transfers." His shoulders relaxed. "I was just there to see the condo." "I know." He looked down at his coffee. "He told me you'd been divorced for 6 months. We had been separated." So he didn't completely lie. He gave you the part of the truth that was useful to him. He gave a humorless laugh. "That sounds like James." He told me James had been trying to explain everything since the sales office incident. According to him, the LLCs were normal, the money was his, the property dispute was me using numbers to punish him. He keeps saying you're trying to take his company. What do you think? "I don't know enough to know." "That's fair." He hesitated. "Do you think he knows he's lying?" I thought about it. "Not always." "What does that mean?" "I think James genuinely believes he earned most of it. He handled the deals. He negotiated with sellers. He became the public face of the company. My work was something his Omega did to help. And when I left my career, that was my choice. So in his mind, he isn't stealing anything. He thinks he's protecting what he earned." Marcus looked at me for a long time. "That's worse." "Why?" "Because if someone knows they're lying, they know there's a lie somewhere." He wrapped both hands around his coffee. "If he honestly thinks he's always been fair, how would you ever convince him he hasn't?" I didn't answer. Because he'd understood something in 15 minutes that I'd spent years trying to name. "How did you get through it?" he asked after a moment. "Living with that." I thought about it. I didn't, not really. I just adapted. I made myself smaller. I stopped asking questions. I told myself it was worth it because we were building something together. I paused. But we weren't building something together. He was building, and I was there. Marcus nodded slowly. That's where I was headed. With him. I could feel it, even before the penthouse thing. He wanted me to be decorative, to be supportive, to not ask too many questions. I knew that feeling. I knew it so well. "What are you going to do now?" I asked. He shrugged. "I don't know. Go back to my apartment. Focus on my work. Figure out who I am without him telling me who to be." "Good luck," I said. "Same to you." We finished our coffee and went our separate ways. We didn't become friends. We didn't team up against him. We exchanged a few messages after that. He asked me if I was okay. I asked him if he was okay, then moved on with our own lives. That was enough. By the 4th month, Derek found another issue. Rental income. The numbers James submitted during the divorce did not fully match earlier tax filings. The differences were large enough that they needed review. Derek asked, "When did you stop handling company accounting?" I gave him the year. "And after that, you were completely out?" "Yes." He nodded. then the later discrepancies aren't part of your work. My first instinct was still to ask, is it serious? Possibly. What happens if there's a tax problem? That's between James, his current accountant, and the tax authorities. I almost asked another question, then stopped. Okay, that's all. Okay. For years, every problem in James's life became my problem. Missing document? I found it. Cash flow problem? I rebuilt the budget. James was anxious? I stayed up with him. Margaret was worried? I reassured her. This time, I closed the file. Whatever happened next was James's responsibility, not mine. A week before mediation, Victoria gave me the latest property analysis. The result was lower than I'd once imagined. Some properties were clearly James's separate property from before the marriage. Margaret could prove that part of the investment money really had come from her. Several properties still carried large mortgages. I read the report carefully. These are definitely his. Based on the records we have, yes. Then don't fight over them. Victoria looked up. You're sure? Yes. I'd spent months demanding that the truth matter. That had to apply even when the truth didn't benefit me. I wanted my share. I didn't need his. Mediation lasted almost 8 hours. We went through everything, line by line. Spreadsheets, bank statements, property valuations, loan balances, company ownership records. It was exhausting and mechanical and somehow liberating. The final accounting showed that more than $3.5 million in asset interests, account funds, and related transactions had either been missing from James's original disclosure or classified in ways that required further review. That didn't mean $3.5 million belonged to me. After subtracting mortgages, confirmed premarital property, legitimate family investment, and other separate interests, we reached a settlement. I would receive $2.7 million in cash, 2 rental properties with no mortgage, my legal share of the retirement accounts, and a portion of investment assets. In exchange, I would release claims against the remaining interests in James's premarital business entities. When the mediator left the room to give us time to review the agreement, James said, I want to talk to Ethan alone. Victoria looked at me. I nodded. We moved into a smaller conference room next door. James stood near the window. He didn't say anything at first. I watched the city lights flicker on in the distance. I thought about all the nights I'd waited for him to come home, watching those same lights. Then, $2.7 million. I waited. And 2 properties. Yes. You really think you should get that much? There it was. After 5 months. After all the records. After all the tracing. He was still asking why I deserved it. I sat down. You want an answer? Yes. Okay. I looked at him. When your first commercial loan was rejected, who rebuilt the financial model? He frowned. You helped. Helped. What do you want me to call it? Work. You weren't an employee. Because eventually you asked me to leave my job. I didn't force you to quit. There was the sentence I knew was coming. You're right. He looked almost relieved. I never locked the front door and stopped you from going to work. Exactly. So don't act like I ruined your career. Do you remember why I left? He didn't answer. Your mother had just had surgery. You were traveling half the month. Everything at home needed someone. I suggested hiring help. Your mother didn't like strangers in the house. And you told me to be patient because she was recovering. He crossed his arms. You could have gone back later. I tried. When I asked about part-time work, he looked away. You told me my salary wasn't worth turning the house upside down. I was trying to make our life easier. I know. Then why are you turning that into some sacrifice I demanded from you? Because later, you used the fact that I had no income as proof that I hadn't contributed. He finally looked at me again. I paid for everything. Yes, you never went without. That is not the same thing as saying everything belongs to you. I was the one out there doing the deals. I negotiated the properties. I built the company. Yes. I nodded. And while you were doing all of that, who handled everything you didn't want to handle? He didn't answer. When you needed a financial model, I was a professional. When you needed someone to take care of your mother, I was family. When you needed someone to keep the household running while you traveled, I was your Omega husband. Then the marriage ended, and suddenly I became one thing, an Omega with no income. James looked away. You're making it sound like I thought you were useless. I don't think you thought I was useless. He looked back. I think you got used to my work being free. His face tightened. I never thought that. Then why do you keep describing the settlement as me taking your money? Silence. Have you ever considered, I asked, that some of it was mine before the settlement? He didn't answer. Finally he said, I wasn't going to leave you with nothing. You offered me a condo you didn't want. It was paid off. And there it is. What? You were still deciding what I should receive. $400,000 should have been enough. $600,000 would have been generous. $1 million would have been extremely generous. I leaned back. But it was always your decision. His face changed slightly. That was the real problem. So what did you want? For you to believe it was ours. He stared at me. I continued. Not every property. Not every dollar. I know you had assets before me. I know some of what you built came directly from your work. But you never really believed my time had the same value as yours. He lowered his eyes. After a while, he asked if I'd handled things differently. I knew where he was going. No Marcus. No missing disclosure. No questionable transfers. Would we still be married? I answered before he finished. If you'd believed from the beginning that my time mattered as much as yours, I paused. We might never have gotten divorced. That was the end of the conversation. No shouting. No apology. No dramatic breakdown. An hour later, we signed the settlement. The tax issues continued after our divorce was fully resolved. At one point, James's attorney contacted Victoria and asked whether I would sign a statement saying some old rental reporting systems had originally been created while I was still involved in the accounting. The implication was obvious. If older systems were partly mine, maybe some later mistakes could be blamed on them. I read the statement. Then I asked Victoria, is this accurate? Not completely. I handed it back. Then I'm not signing it. That may make his tax situation harder. I understand. And I did. Later, I heard James paid back taxes and penalties. He sold several properties. The company became smaller. Margaret sold a vacation home. That was all I knew. I didn't ask for more. One day, Jenny said, you're seriously not curious about how he's doing? I thought about it. Not really. She stared at me. That may be the healthiest thing you've ever said. I laughed. Maybe it was. I no longer needed James to be miserable in order to believe leaving him had been right. I did not buy the $2.1 million penthouse. Jenny was personally offended. Why not? Because I don't like it. You stared at the photos for 10 minutes. I was staring at them. She pointed at me. That's even more reason to buy it. Move in. Make Margaret drive past it every week. I laughed. If I spend almost $2 million just to make my ex-husband uncomfortable, I'm still building my life around him. Jenny opened her mouth, then closed it. Okay. I hate that you're right. I bought a townhouse instead. Less than half the price. Not huge. Not impressive. But it had a south-facing backyard. The realtor kept talking about the remodeled kitchen and the primary suite. I barely heard her. I stood in the yard for 10 minutes. There was sunlight enough for flowers. So I bought it. During the first week, I brought home roses, hydrangeas, lavender, jasmine, a small lemon tree, white orchids. In the second year of our marriage, I'd planted a rose bush in a container on our balcony. Margaret said it attracted bugs. One afternoon while I was out, she threw it away. I was upset. James didn't understand why. It's one plant, he said. Just buy another one. We never did. Now, no one asked me why I needed so many flowers. I could have as many as I wanted. When I left my career, I hadn't completely given up my CPA license. I'd kept it in an inactive status. Every renewal period, I would stare at the form and think, maybe one day. I never knew what one day meant. 8 months after the divorce, I completed the continuing education I needed and moved my license back to active status. Then I started applying for jobs. The first firm didn't hire me. The interviewer was kind. Your foundation is strong, but you've been away from the profession for almost 9 years. Forensic accounting has changed a lot. Electronic records, data tools, financial discovery software. He gave me an apologetic smile. We're looking for someone with more recent experience. I told him I understood. Then I sat in my car for 20 minutes before starting the engine. That was one of the few moments after the divorce when I truly doubted myself. 9 years was 9 years. Wanting to come back did not erase the gap. That night, I registered for 2 updated forensic accounting courses. I learned new software. I reviewed current case studies. I practiced tracing transactions through digital records. I spent hours in front of my laptop, going through exercises until my eyes burned. A month later, I interviewed again. The partner looked at my resume. 9-year career gap. Yes. Does that worry you? Yes. That answer surprised him. So I've been fixing it. I told him about the courses. Then I told him about the divorce case. Over the previous several months, I'd worked alongside attorneys and forensic accountants while tracing money through 4 LLCs, more than a dozen disputed properties, joint accounts, family transfers, and a refinance application. He leaned forward. What exactly did you do? Reviewed bank statements. Tracked where money left and where it returned. Matched down payments to source accounts. Compared old property schedules with current ownership records. Reconstructed the timing around the refinance. I didn't make it sound more complicated than it was. Because eventually, most financial investigations came down to a very basic question. Someone says the money belongs to them. You ask, where did it come from? The partner closed my resume. Can you start next Monday? For a second, I thought I'd misheard him. Then I smiled. Yes. On my first day back in an office, I opened a balance sheet on my computer, then a bank statement, then a cash flow report. I had to blink a few times. The skills were still there. Some were rusty. Some needed updating. But they were mine. They'd always been mine. For years, I'd used them for everyone except myself. A little over a year later, I started handling smaller marital asset investigations. One afternoon, an Omega sat across from me in the conference room. He kept twisting the cuff of his sleeve. He had that look, the look I'd seen in my own mirror 1,000 times. The look of someone who'd been slowly erased. My alpha handles all the money, he said. I don't know what we actually own. I nodded. And I haven't worked in years. He looked embarrassed. So maybe I don't really have a right to ask for much. For a second, I saw myself. Not because our marriages were identical, but because I knew that voice. The voice of someone who'd been told for so long that financial information belonged to someone else that he'd started to believe he didn't even deserve to ask questions. I pushed a blank asset worksheet across the table. Don't worry about what you're entitled to yet. He looked up. Then what do I do? Start with facts. What accounts exist? What properties? Whose names are on the companies? How much debt is there? Where did the money come from? I tapped the worksheet. We find those things first. Your attorney can decide the legal part. He slowly nodded. That afternoon, I finally understood why I wanted to stay in the field. It wasn't about helping people punish their spouses. It was about helping someone see the full picture before anyone convinced them they had no value in it. That same year, I rented a tiny corner storefront near my office. 600 square feet. White walls. A full glass front. A jacaranda tree outside. I didn't quit accounting. The store didn't need to support me. It only opened on weekends. I wanted a flower studio. That was the whole reason. No business empire. No grand plan. I liked flowers. I named it Second Bloom. Jenny saw the sign and immediately made a face. That's a little dramatic. Then don't come. She arrived first on opening day with a flower arrangement so large it almost blocked the door. More than a year later, on a Saturday evening, I was trimming white roses when the bell above the door rang. I looked up. James stood there. I hadn't seen him in a long time. He didn't look destroyed. He wasn't broke and desperate. He hadn't aged 20 years. He just looked ordinary. Blue shirt, jeans, a little gray near his temples. Less of that old confidence that used to make him enter every room as if everyone there had been waiting for him. Hi. Hi. He looked around. I saw Jenny post pictures of the shop. She explained how to find it. It looks good. Thanks. He walked toward a bucket of sunflowers. Can you make me a bouquet? Who's it for? My niece. She graduates from college today. What's she like? Yellow. I chose sunflowers, chamomile, a little greenery. James stood quietly on the other side of the counter. I was aware of him watching me, the way his eyes followed my hands as I worked. Those same eyes that had once looked at me like I was the center of the universe. When I was almost done, he said, "My mother lives in Arizona now. With my aunt." I kept wrapping the flowers. "How is she?" "She's okay." He hesitated. "She asked me to tell you she's sorry." I tied the ribbon. "Okay." He looked surprised. "That's it." I looked up. What else should I say? He gave a small laugh. "Fair enough." I handed him the bouquet. He paid. But he didn't leave immediately. "Ethan." "Yeah. Sometimes I still think." I shook my head. "Don't." He looked at me. You know what I was going to say. Probably. If things had been different. I met his eyes. It doesn't matter anymore. He looked down at the flowers. "Things happened," I said. "We both have lives now." After a moment, he nodded. "You're right." He reached the door, then stopped. "Ethan." I looked up. "Do you still hate me?" I actually had to think about it. "No." "Why?" I looked at him. "Because you're not worth taking up that much space in my life anymore." James said nothing. After a few seconds, he nodded. Then he opened the door and left. The bell rang softly behind him. I didn't walk to the window. I didn't check what car he drove. I didn't wonder where he lived. I went back to the roses. Less than 2 minutes later, the bell rang again. A young Omega walked in, probably mid-20s, carrying a work bag. He had the kind of open, earnest face that hadn't yet learned to be guarded. "Are you still open?" "Yes." He looked around. "I want to buy something for someone." "For someone?" "For me." He said it a little sheepishly, like he was admitting something embarrassing. I smiled. "Then you should choose carefully." He walked slowly along the display. His fingers brushed against the petals as he passed. He seemed uncertain, like he wasn't used to choosing things for himself. Eventually, he stopped in front of a bundle of pink tulips. The buds were still mostly closed, tight little fists of color waiting to unfold. "These are pretty." "They are. But they haven't opened yet." "Not completely." He pointed toward another bunch, fully open tulips in the same shade. "Should I get the ones that are already open instead?" I picked up the closed tulips. "These are good." He hesitated. "They don't look as pretty right now." I carried them to the counter and laid them across the wrapping paper. Outside, the evening light came through the glass, golden and soft. The shadow of the jacaranda tree moved across the floor, branches dancing in the breeze. I trimmed the stems. "It's okay." I wrapped the flowers. In a few days, I tied the ribbon around them, a simple white satin bow. "They'll open beautifully." He smiled. For the first time, his shoulders dropped. That same release I'd seen on James's face in the courtroom, but different. This wasn't relief that something heavy had lifted. This was hope. The first spark of it. "Thanks," he said. I needed to hear that. He paid and left, carrying his tulips carefully, like they were something precious. I watched him go through the glass front of the shop. The sun was setting over Seattle, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. I thought about all the things I'd lost, and all the things I'd found. 9 years. 9 years I'd given to someone who'd never truly seen me. But they weren't wasted. They'd made me who I was. They'd taught me what I deserved. I went back to arranging the roses, my hands moving with practiced ease. The scent of flowers filled the air, lavender and jasmine, roses and chamomile. This was my life now. My second bloom. And it was beautiful.